Okay, today we're talking about physical health as far as culture is concerned. Next time we'll talk about mental illness, and then that is the last chapter. Next week will be the last lecture. So here we go. Or not. There we go. Okay, physical health. Genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as a species. So if we look at everybody in this picture, all of them are very genetically close to one another. So if we did DNA studies, they would be, and this is one of the reasons why it's so easy to look at DNA studies. Uh, they've programmed the genome, and despite the fact that people are of different races and comes from different parts of the world, the reality is there haven't been that many mutations from the original humans to make us look or to make us actually be that much different. So the reality is, and looking at a picture like this, it's people are so much closer. They look very, very similar to one another, whether they're Asian or Caucasian or South African or Indonesian or Malaysian or whatever. The only real difference is their skin tone, and there's not that much difference in their skin tone. And skin tone means very, very little. And hair texture, I guess, is another thing that you could look at, as curious as that is. So the reality is we're all really, really close. Not only that, but if we were that much different, then we wouldn't be able to reproduce with one another. Like horses and donkeys can breed, and they can create an offspring, but that offspring isn't viable. But we don't really see that in humans. We're just too close to each other. We've got the same number of chromosomes, and we're all really, really close to each other. Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, and they all lived in Africa until approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago. They moved that back a little bit. They think maybe it's more like 70 to 80,000 years ago. But that's information that we have from the last year or so. And this is constantly changing, of course. And of course, so the question is, when did people move out of Africa? It's the out of Africa theory. And all of this is just theoretical. We're not exactly sure when any of this took place, but we can tell that all of us are very, very similar to one another by looking at our DNA. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of culture-gene coevolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information, and this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. So somebody that say they uh, one of the things that happened during World War II, the Japanese realized that they were going to have to straddle the equator to conquer the world. So one of the problems that they had was Japan, of course, is kind of far north. When I was living in Japan, we lived in the farthest northern region in Japan, and it got pretty cold and it snowed a lot. Well, the people that lived in that part of Japan were very similar genetically to me, because I was raised in Indiana, and it snows and gets cold in Indiana just like it does in Hachinohe, Misawa. Actually, it was Misawa, Japan. So we were really kind of similar because we had evolved in a similar circumstance. So the Japanese realized that they were going to have to send some of their soldiers into to a tropical area, and they weren't exactly sure what was going on. They didn't know if they could send somebody from Misawa onto the equator to conquer or to fight in a jungle situation. And what they realized, or what they discovered after doing research, But what they discovered is that somebody who is born in a very cold climate doesn't have the same type and the same number of sweat glands that somebody who has evolved in a warmer climate. So it's easier for, say, the Dene people to survive in a desert than it would be for me. And that may be one of the reasons why, when I lived in Saley, I was probably not nearly as happy with the environment as people who had lived there for thousands of years or hundreds of years or whatever it was, because those individuals were used to that type of weather, and I wasn't. I wasn't. I'm not used to dry weather. I'm not used to hot weather. Of course, I was never there in the summertime, but it's culturally we mesh our genes with our cultural needs, and of course, our culture has to do with where we are and how we evolved. A common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in a dietary practice such as milk consumption. We drink cow's milk. Well, why in the world did we ever start drinking cow's milk? Well, Europeans do. The Europeans made. Look at all the dairy products that we have. We have cheese, we have milk, we have yogurt, we have all kinds of interesting types of milk that we consume. Well, some people evolved without consuming those types of things, like Asians. Asians didn't have cows, so they didn't, and they did have some sheep, but they didn't really make cheese. They didn't really drink the milk. So people that evolved eating dairy products became very important to them. But for people who did not, they became lactose intolerant. And so if you are lactose intolerant, then that is one of the reasons. The reason is because of your evolution and because of the way that the area that you lived in. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of the nutrition that people derive from their diets. And potentially, this is one of the reasons why there is so much diabetes among the indigenous populations of the Southwest. It is because as you were evolving, you did not eat the food that Westerners were, which was typical in a Western environment. You didn't eat the vegetables that they ate. You didn't eat nearly as much sugar as they did. You never consumed dairy products like they did. Most of the meat that you had was very lean. If you go to Europe, they had cleared out their wild population, so they didn't really have that much wild game to eat, and so they had to domesticate their meat source, and that became the cow and also the pig. They never domesticated deers. I don't know why they didn't do that, but anyway, and these were fairly sedentary animals, and they moved very slowly, and they accumulated a lot of fat. They're not like buffalo. They're not like antelope or deer that run all the time. So their muscle mass was not nearly as lean as the muscle mass of the creatures that you found edible in your environment. So it has to do with culture. Humans vary in the amount of starch that they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. Foraging societies eat a lot of meat. Uh, Agricultural societies eat a lot of eat a lot of starches. Eat a lot of corn, wheat, oats. That's one of the reasons why we eat the grains that we eat. Those are the starches that we consume. Potatoes, you guys had potatoes. They were here before they were over there. So potatoes come from South America. And of course, corn was a huge staple that allowed the indigenous people of the Americas to really expand their population. People from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest the starch. And this is according to Perry et al. In 2007. You also had a lot of fowl. Turkey were very popular, so were rabbits. So were some of the rodents that are consumed. Uh, Squirrels were eaten. In some parts of Indian country, they used to consume dog. Um, Not so much here, but up north, that was very common. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forests. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin that is associated with sickle cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria. So the individuals that were living in that climate, because there were a lot of mosquitoes around, the Anopheles mosquito, which causes malaria, they were coming down with malaria, so they developed a hemoglobin, a genetic mutation, which allowed them to survive malaria, become more resistant to malaria. Now, as interesting as this is, let's say two people who have the sickle cell trait reproduce, and they produce 4 children. Well, one of the children won't have any. They won't have any resistance to the malaria. Two of them will have resistance to malaria, and the other one will have sickle cell anemia. So of those 4 children, one will die of malaria, and one will die of sickle cell anemia, and 2 are resistant to malaria. As weird as that may seem. So, but that was better than everybody dying, of course. So this new type of hemoglobin, this sickle cell hemoglobin, actually saved the people of sub-Saharan Africa from dying from malaria infections. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. 5-HTTLPR, A118G, and MAOA are alleles that have been found in Asian samples, but not in European samples. Could they have something to do with social sensitivity? And the reality is that Asians seem to be able to live in a more crowded environment than Westerners do. As a matter of fact, Westerners became very frustrated with the crowded conditions in Europe, and they moved, and they moved en masse. They moved. A lot of them moved to the United States. They moved to Canada. They moved to South America. And the reason they did that is because they had this itch to get away from people, to get away from the highly crowded conditions. Asians, not so much. A genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking among Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows an opposite effect among Koreans. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. A variant associated with decreased emotion suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who are genetically more similar to Koreans but culturally more similar to European Americans showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. Dutchmen average 6'1", which is 3 inches taller than the average American man, who stands at just under 5'10". In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. So in 1865, Americans were taller than the Dutch. But now, Dutch are 3 inches taller on the average than Americans. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income. Their gross natural product per capita was third highest in the world. At that time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Britons, people from England, the same height as Australians, and 2 inches taller than Norwegians, 3 inches taller than the French, 4 inches taller than Italians, and more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese. And isn't that curious? So you would go to Europe and Americans would be taller than everybody. And that's one of the things that they first noticed when we sent soldiers over to Europe during World War I. One of the first things they noticed is how tall we were as compared to all the other people that were fighting. South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts, and that's today. South Koreans are that much taller than North Koreans. Japanese immigrants to California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their compatriots in Japan. Dairy consumption in particular has been linked to height. So the more milk you drink, the taller that you will get potentially. Now, when I was young, that's all I drank was milk. Milk and water, because we didn't have anything, or my parents wouldn't buy anything else, Kool-Aid or whatever, or pop. Of course, pop costs money, so they didn't want to do that. But they were willing to feed us all the milk that we wanted. So I drank a lot of milk. I'm only 5'6", but my mother's only 4 foot, or was only 4'8". My dad's only 5'7", but he has height in his family. So potentially, I do have two brothers at about 5'10". So I'm that much shorter. And if you were ever in my office and saw the picture, I've got all of my brothers and my dad and I were all in the military at the same time, and we took a picture in our uniforms. And as you can see, I'm the shortest one in the picture. And then I have a brother that's about 5'7", 5'8". And then my other two brothers are 5'10", and then my dad's 5'7". So I'm the shortest one of the group. And it probably has to do with the milk that we drank to build bones, to build strong bones. And of course, that's what they advertise on television: drink milk and build strong bones. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours more than American infants. People in countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, Japan and Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount that they sleep. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than 2 Canadian samples. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it is cultural. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided in 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, members of the executive class were 60% more likely to die over the 10-year period. The clerical staff was 120% more likely to die, and the unskilled laborers were 170% more likely to die. And the reason I have the picture of policemen and all the pictures coming up is because we're talking about civil servants. And what does a civil servant look like? Well, the only one that you can tell the difference between one and the other is policemen. And these are English policemen. Despite the fact that these are very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It is actually larger than smokers and non-smokers. So what are we talking about here? We're saying that the higher you are in your socioeconomic status, the more money you make, the longer that you will live. And if the less money you make, depending on where you are in the hierarchy, is when you will die. That you're more likely to die if you're an unskilled laborer than you are if you're a member of the clerical staff. And the executive class, they live much longer than everybody else does. Now, why is this? And of course, we've looked at this not just in England, but we've also looked at this in the United States. We've looked at this in various countries, and we see exactly the same thing. If you are an unskilled laborer, you're going to die younger. Now, is that because unskilled laborers drink and smoke too much? I'm guessing that's probably not it. It is the amount of stress that is in their life. How am I going to make ends meet here? The people in the middle are okay, and the people who are living the executive class, they don't have to worry about money. They've got enough. They really don't have to worry about it. The same thing was observed in Denmark. The same thing was observed in Norway. The same thing was observed in Finland. The same thing was observed in France. The same thing was observed in Japan. The same thing was observed in New Zealand. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest level. And this is one of the reasons why we have so many rich people that are arguing about our health care. Why in the world do they not want to give health care to the poor people? And the answer is because now they live a lot longer than everybody else. So potentially, if we gave everybody the same amount of money, we would all live the same length of time. But a lot of it has to do with the quality of the health care that they get. And they're afraid that if everybody gets the same health care that they get, that everybody will be living as long as they do, and they won't be superior to everybody else. That's a fairly negative way of looking at it. But by golly, why in the world were wealthy people, why in the world was Donald Trump so upset with the Affordable Care Act? It gave health insurance to 18 million more people. Why in the world would somebody complain about that? But there are a lot of conservatives and wealthy conservatives that are very upset about the fact that they have to pay into the Affordable Care Act, and now it upsets them. And of course, this is death rates, how they rise as far as income is concerned. The higher you are, the lower your death rate. The lower income you are, the higher your death rate. The Fulani, Mosi, and Remabe all live in northeast Burkina Faso, and this is where Burkina Faso is right there. As you can see, it's in West Africa. The region is endemic with malaria, which is a major cause of death in the area. The Mosi and the Remabe have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed much genetic resistance to malaria over time. The Fulani moved to this region in the early 19th century as part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in the area. When the Fulani first arrived, they conquered, enslaved, and decultured the other ethnic groups in the area, including the Mosi and the Remabe. The higher status that they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for their genetic vulnerability to malaria. As weird as that may seem. So just because they are dominant they actually live longer than everybody else, despite the fact that they are more susceptible to malaria, which is fairly devastating. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. In the British civil servant study, all the workers had the same access to state-provided health care, yet there were still pronounced differences. People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, to eat a poor diet, and are less likely to exercise. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health compromising behaviors such as smoking and drinking in order to cope with the difficulties in their lives, and stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and an increased likelihood of illness. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes, those with lower socioeconomic status who felt that they had much control in their lives had levels of health and well-being that are comparable with those in higher income groups. Now, this is really kind of interesting because people get upset with individuals who are poor, but they demand things from you. And one of the reasons that they may be doing that has to do with this word right here, control. The more control they feel in a situation, the less stress that they will feel. And that may be a trick for these select individuals to be able to survive where other people don't. Stress and feelings of a lack of control tend to be more pronounced among those who occupy a subordinate position and are subject to the demands of those who are able to make decisions for them. Now, this may be one of the reasons why people celebrated so fervently when Joe Biden won the election. Donald Trump is far more authoritarian than Obama was, or even Bush, or any of the other presidents that we've ever had. He was authoritarian, and people who like to feel in control were not able to feel that way when Donald Trump was president. So that may be one of the reasons why people were so happy that and felt relieved. I saw an individual crying on television. He was a commentator, and he was trying to say how he felt, and he started crying because Donald Trump is no longer president. He was African American, and he said, "Now I don't have to try to explain to my children to be afraid. All that fear is gone." It may have to do with what we are talking about right now. People that like that whole idea of authoritarianism, of people telling you what to do, those individuals may have voted for Trump. The individuals that understood what was going on may have voted against Trump. As a matter of fact, the Navajo Nation went very strongly for Joe Biden. So Joe Biden he needs to be nice to all indigenous peoples, but especially the Navajo Nation, which probably will deliver Arizona to him, despite, the difference is less than 100,000, I believe. So it may have been the Navajo Nation that delivered the Arizona to Joe Biden. This is not just true of humans. Research with various primates has revealed that those individuals who were subordinate in a hierarchy experience greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation. The high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. And the reality is that when I am in a situation like I was in say, Lee, where I had a boss and he had a boss, and then there's the president of the school. A lot of times I tried to stay away from those guys. And the reason I tried to stay away from them is because I wanted to feel like I wasn't being controlled by anybody. So it was not a bad thing as far as I was concerned to stay away from those people. The social features that I'm sorry, the societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic status people find themselves in modernized, industrialized societies. And you know, this could answer a lot of questions. This is psychology. This is social psychology. Why do poor people? Why do they act the way that they do? Why do they? Um, you know, how can you help these people not feel like they are being put upon? Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation, of knowing that others are doing better than you, might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. So when we look at a group of people and they've all got somewhere between $100,000 and $1 million, they're all making between $100,000 and $1 million a year. If we look at that group of individuals, which ones are going to be under more stress? Well, the less money that they make, the more stress that they will feel. Now, the reality is $100,000 is a lot of money, and you should be fairly happy living on $100,000. And you would feel happy if you lived among people who are making less money than you. But if you're living among people and you're the poorest person in the group, despite the fact you're making good money, then you're going to feel a lot more stressed. That's the way it works. There's a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to a gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 per year. And as we can see, where are we? We're right here at 48,442. And these are the ones. These are the ones that aren't feeling any stress. Greece, the ones that are feeling stress are the people that live in Greece, Russia, China, India, Ghana, and Afghanistan. And people who make more than $30,000, Korea, Spain, Italy, Japan, France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Germany, Australia, Canada, Ireland, Netherlands, United States, all these people are not feeling nearly as much stress. So these people are feeling okay. And these are the people that are feeling put upon. Above the per capita gross domestic product, $30,000, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans, yet these people don't seem to be worse off in terms of health outcomes. Why not? Because according to the people that are around them, they're doing okay. They're doing fine. So they're, of course, they're not going to have any negative health outcomes. Poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and wealth is actually a relationship between health and one's income relative to those around you. So if you go to Harvard and you're around a lot of very wealthy people from the East Coast, then potentially you're going to feel bad, even though your parents may make a lot of money. They make pretty good money. Now, I went to a college like that. I went to an elite college in Indiana, and my parents were fairly comfortable. I mean, we were doing fine. So as long as I was living in Delaware County, in Muncie, Indiana, I felt okay. But once I went away to college, I went to an elite college on the other side of the state, but I was around a lot of very, very wealthy people. One of the guys, one of the guys that I went to college with was an heir to the Listerine, as weird as that sounds, The Listerine fortune. His grandfather had invented Listerine, and he had he had all the money he wanted. He didn't really understand money, but of course, I grew up where you had to think about how much money you had in your pocket, and he grew up where he never even thought about it. He never had to worry about it. They used to feed us every day of the week except Sunday. Sundays they only served breakfast and lunch, so you had to find your own supper. Now, I almost always never had enough money to go buy supper, so I had to, even though I was in college and I was 17, 18, 19 years old, 20, 21. Wait a minute. I started when I was 17. 17, 18, 19, 20. Yeah. I turned 21 after I left, after I graduated. I turned 21. Anyway, that's not important. I almost never ate dinner on Sunday. So for Christmas one year, while I was in college, I asked for a popcorn popper so I could at least eat something on Sunday afternoon because I didn't have any money to go buy any food. Now, that guy, he didn't have to worry about it. He always had money in his pocket. If he ran out of money, he just called daddy up on the telephone and he would send him, a check for $100 or whatever. Now, this is the weird part. Of course, I went to college. When I went to college, there were six of us in the family, and there certainly wasn't enough money for all of us for my dad to buy us cars. But this guy came to school with two cars. He had a Shelby Cobra and he had a Maserati, and he gave one of the cars to his roommate. And at first, the roommate drove the Maserati and he drove the Shelby Cobra because it was flashier. And then later he realized, I don't know. Anyway, they switched cars later on. But this guy got to drive a car. His roommate got to drive a car throughout his college career, and here I am. I didn't have a car, so I didn't have any way to get home, which is probably a good thing because I probably would have gone home every weekend. Anyway, as weird as that is. Anyway, income and health is actually a relationship between health and the one's income relative to those around you. So this guy, as long as he's living around other homeless people, he probably doesn't feel too bad. These ladies, as long as they are around the rich people in their community, this one who doesn't have as much money as this one or this one probably feels like she's deprived. She feels worse than he does because the people he's around, he's doing okay. But the people she's around, she's at the lower end of the spectrum. I'm just making this up. I have no idea which one is which. Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they are likely far less poor. They feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poor. So just like this guy doesn't feel so bad because everybody around him is worse off than he is, uh, he feels okay. He doesn't live around these people, so he doesn't have to worry about them. But this lady does, or I don't know, one of those ladies makes less money, can buy less. She can't buy a new car every year, whatever. So that's the way it works. So it's the people you live around. Poor Americans often earn an income that is not that poor by international standards. However, they are poor compared to their fellow Americans, and their health suffers accordingly. Disadvantaged minorities around the world tend to be of a lower socioeconomic status, and they often experience worse health outcomes than those of majority members. In particular, African Americans in the United States suffer from relatively worse health outcomes. And this is one of the reasons why trying to do away with the Affordable Care Act was so devastating for poor families, especially poor African American and Hispanic families, because it affected them far more than it affected other groups of people. Now the reality is that about 14% of our population is Hispanic, and about 12% is African American. So the reality is it actually affected more white people than it did any minority people. The ACA, just like welfare, there are far more white people on welfare than there are any other groups. However, there's a larger percentage of African Americans, there's a larger percentage of Hispanics that are on welfare than Caucasians. Looking at the 15 leading causes of death in the United States, African Americans have higher death rates than that of European Americans for 12 of them. African Americans tend to be of much lower socioeconomic status than European Americans. Many of the reasons for their higher mortality can be explained by the socioeconomic difference. And the three are respiratory disease, Alzheimer's disease, and suicide. Suicide is much higher among Caucasian European Americans than it is among African Americans. It's lowest among African Americans. Alzheimer's disease, because they live so long, and that's an aging disease, and then they get respiratory diseases more readily. As weird as that is. Infant mortality rates among African Americans are about double that of European Americans, and these differences are also hold for those African Americans who are highly educated, as weird as that seems. So despite the fact that they're highly educated, they have enough money, their infant mortality rate is still so much higher. And as you can see, here's American Indian, Alaska Native. This is infant mortality rates. This is your African American population. And as you can see, it is higher. Hypertension is especially high among African American men, and unlike other health outcomes, hypertension rates are slightly higher for African American men with college degrees than they are for African American men with less education. Now, Barack Obama is interesting. Barack Obama's father was African. He wasn't African American. And because he was African, Barack Obama probably has a much lower blood pressure than his wife, who was African American. Her parents were both African American. So his father was from Kenya, and his mother was a white lady, and so potentially he has a lower blood pressure than Joe Biden does, because Joe Biden comes from Irish stock, and since Irish were denigrated for an extended length of time, of course that caused a lot of stress. He comes from a working class family, and he does too, but it's different. It's just a different situation. Now Joe Biden, of course, is the president. So there you go. Here's a picture of two presidents. The opposite holds true for African American women and for European men and women. Compared to European Americans, Latinos tend to have lower mortality rates for 10 of the 15 leading causes of death. This ethnic difference is all the more puzzling because Latinos tend to be to have a lower socioeconomic status than European Americans, and hence should be expected to suffer worse health outcomes. And this is known as the epidemiological paradox. So if we look at the average Latino, Latinx is what I have been seeing lately. So maybe Latino is a antiquated term. Anyway, this is known as the epidemiological paradox. They're poor, yet they live longer than European Americans. Lots of people are trying to answer this question, but nobody really has a definitive answer. The epidemiological paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. And this came out in the last election. Why in the world, with Trump saying such negative things about Hispanic immigrants, why in the world did Florida, which has a huge Latino population, why in the world did they go for Trump? Why in the world did Latinos in Florida go for Trump? And the answer was because Latinos aren't all the same. Just because you speak Spanish, Spanish is your language of origin, or is your original language, doesn't mean that you are from Mexico. You may be from Puerto Rico. You may be from Cuba. You may be from Venezuela or Colombia, and that's one of the things that happened in Florida. There were select groups of Latinos in Florida who were very much against Donald Trump, but there were groups like the Cubans and the Venezuelans who were very much in favor of Donald Trump, and it's because he said that if Joe Biden is elected president, the United States is going to go communist, and of course Venezuela was under a socialist regime, and Cuba has been under a communist regime since 1959. So they felt that information was made more of an impact on them than all the insults that Donald Trump has made toward Hispanics. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans do, and there are no explanations why. The genetic structure is exactly the same. Their ethnicity is well, it's not exactly the same because one comes from a little island in the Caribbean and the other comes from a non-island in Mexico. It's part of North America, actually. Latinos tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos, although they also tend to exercise less. The longer they have lived in the United States, the more likely that they are to engage in unhealthy behaviors as they come to drink more, to smoke more, and are more likely to become obese, like this young gentleman right here eating this huge piece of pizza. Some cultural factors are more pronounced among Latinos, such as the high value placed on childbearing and a good deal of emotional support provided by the community seem to provide an important health buffer. Really kind of curious. I was listening to a news report on NPR a couple of years ago, and they were talking. This lady is Puerto Rican, and her mother's Puerto Rican, of course, and she was living in New York, and her mother was living in Puerto Rico. And then her mother moved to Atlanta, Georgia, which was kind of interesting. So she used to visit her mother, and her mother would always tell her how skinny she was, that she was way too skinny. She needed to bulk up. That men don't marry women who don't have who aren't curvy is one of the things. And of course, she was talking about the size of her chest. But she was also talking about the fact that she looked skinny. She thought she looked slender. That's not a negative as far as Latino, at least the Latino mothers are concerned. But because she lived in New York City and had lived there for an extended length of time, she wanted to look like the people around her. And of course, those people were very slender. And so she wanted to be slender too. And her mother made fun of her because she looked so skinny. Latinos derive health benefits from cultural scripts such as simpatica and their unusually high levels of positive affect. In traditional non-Western societies, beliefs in the supernatural causes of illness are widespread. These range from theories that aggressive spirits such as ghosts cause disease, which is the most widespread theory of disease, to accounts of witchcraft, sorcery, mystical retributions, and sinful violations of taboos. Among the Azande of West Africa, the primary cause of illness is attributed to witchcraft. Some Zande are believed to be witches, and the source of their witchcraft is believed to be a small organ in their bodies which can be inherited from their parents. Now, this is an Azande. This is a Zande lady. Hi, Stacy. This is Karen. I was in church. So there you go. Look at her eyes, because this becomes very important. The Zande witches do not perform any rites, use any potions, or cast any spells. Rather, witches conduct their witchcraft entirely through their minds. And look at their eyes and how penetrating their eyes are. Ooh. When a Zande develops a slowly progressing illness, it is believed to be the result of a witch who is consuming the soul of its victim's organs, a little bit at a time. When a Zande develops a sudden acute illness, it is believed to be the result of a sorcerer casting a spell on them. In traditional Chinese medicine, a healthy body is one in which the dialectical forces of yin and yang are in balance. Any imbalances are believed to ultimately lead to illness. A person who has liver fire will have symptoms such as headaches, flushed face, and anger, and this illness is believed to be caused by having too much yang and not enough yin. Such an imbalance can be corrected by acupuncture, puncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle. Western doctors often disagree with one another. There are rather striking differences between medical practices of French and American doctors. The French believe in a concept of terrain or balance. They believe that everything should be in balance. This emphasis on balance shifts drug consumption away from antibiotics and toward various tonics and vitamins that are believed to strengthen the immune system. Long rests and spa visits are also viewed as an important part of the lifestyle that rejuvenates the terrain. Hospital stays are relatively long in France, about double the length in the United States, for the same procedures, to provide ample time for recuperation. Do I talk about? I don't think I do. Wait a minute. Okay. They also believe in clowns. the, Fr- the French will send clowns to people's rooms to make them feel better, and they think that they believe that replaces or reaffirms their terrain. And as you can, this is a picture of a lady who is a clown who wanders around the hospital, making people feel better. And this is a French hospital. You can tell it's a French hospital by the this is the kind of windows they have, and this is known as a roulade. That's actually, well, it's not quite bulletproof, but it feels like it's bulletproof when you're there. Anyway, that's a French window. When the Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives often commented on how badly they smelled. This is because the common medical practice in the 17th century in France stated that bodily secretions offered a layer of protection, so it was considered unhealthy to bathe frequently. And if you've ever been around Frenchmen, they still kind of have that same idea. It's not like they take a shower every day and put on deodorant. They don't put on deodorant. They feel that keeps them healthy. And maybe it does keep them healthy because it keeps people away from them, but that's not a very funny joke as far as the French are concerned. 1976, an article in Le Monde stated, and the Le Monde is the major newspaper / magazine in France. It means the world. Le Monde stated that the French hospital patient had the right to a monthly bath and to a weekly foot washing. Now you can imagine what would happen in the United States if somebody didn't take a bath for a month. But this, of course, in the United States, we have our sense of cleanliness and odors are a lot more sensitive than the French, and for that reason, of course, we bathe a lot more frequently. French dermatologists recommend that people, even those with oily hair, not wash their hair more than once a week because doing so causes a greater amount of oil to be secreted. And that is the way they think in France. The metaphor used in the United States by doctors is that the body is like a machine that needs to be tended to regularly to ensure that it is running well. When there are problems with the body, it is often treated in ways that you might expect to see a machine repaired. U.S. medicine is known as the most aggressive in the world. Surgical procedures are used far more in the United States than in other countries where malfunctioning parts are removed, replaced, and or physically altered. You don't like the way you look? Have a facelift. U.S. doctors are more likely than European doctors to use surgery rather than drugs, but when drugs are prescribed in the United States, they are prescribed at higher dosages than any other country. It is rare in the United States for a doctor to prescribe rest and relaxation as a curative agent. They want to snip, snip, snip. U.S. doctors tend to search for an external cause of illness, such as bacteria and viruses. U.S. doctors prescribe more antibiotics than doctors from elsewhere, and Americans tend to have a greater concern for cleanliness and attempt to avoid contact with germs. You do not see antibacterial soap in Europe. They don't believe in it. As a matter of fact, they don't. They will only bathe once or twice a week. Actually, saying twice a week is being generous. They will only bathe once a week. And we noticed this when we lived in Germany, that there was, and I think the night for bathing is either Friday night or Saturday night. Because by Friday, boy, I'll tell you, there's an odor going around the place. And that's the end of the chapter. Kind of a fascinating chapter. Next week, we will tackle mental health. Culture and mental health, which is fascinating. So I'll tell you what, I'll see you guys next week. Stay safe, and congratulations to President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris for their victory.